There's a particular face people make at an old man, on his own, and I've spent 9 years learning how to make them stop. I'm Walter, 82, retired carpenter, 9 years on my own, since I lost my Helen. If you felt somebody's voice change the moment they found out you live alone, you'll know exactly what I mean. Start with number 1 and stay for number 4, because that's the one that turns the whole business on its head. Number 1. I can sit down alone at a table in a public restaurant and eat a meal without anything in my hands to hide behind. Saturday mornings, the diner in town. Same booth if it's free. Coffee and eggs, and I'm there about 40 minutes. No newspaper. No book. Nothing in my hand at all. And I want to say first what pity actually is, because I think people misuse the word. Pity is not kindness, and it isn't sympathy. Pity is a conclusion. It's what happens when somebody looks at you and decides in about a second and a half what your life must be like, and then talks to the conclusion instead of to you. The man alone at a table gets it more than almost anybody, because everybody in that room has already decided the story. There's a fellow with nobody, having his breakfast on his own on a Saturday. Now this is what I worked out, and it took me about 2 years. They take their cue from you. A man reading a newspaper at a table by himself is a man occupying time until something better. A man sitting there eating his eggs and looking out the window is a man having his breakfast. Same table, same eggs, same absence of a wife. Entirely different read, and the whole of the difference is whether you look like you're waiting for your life to start again. If you're walking this road alone, subscribe so you don't have to walk it alone. All right, number 2. And before I get to it, I could not do that at 74, and I'd not have anybody thinking I walked into that diner naturally. For the first 2 years, I took the paper every time and held it up in front of me like a man at a bus stop. I'd have told you it was because I wanted to read the paper. It wasn't. It was so nobody in that room could see a man on his own with nothing to do. What changed it is that I forgot it one Saturday. Left it on the seat of the truck and didn't notice until my eggs were in front of me. 40 minutes and nothing happened at all. Nobody looked. A fellow 2 stools along said something about the road commission, and I said something back, which had never once happened in 2 years behind that newspaper. The paper wasn't protecting me from anything. It was a wall I'd built and stood behind, and the only thing it kept out was other people. Now I can answer the question honestly, in either direction, without managing the other person's face. The question is, how are you getting on? You know the one. It's got about 3 extra syllables in it when it's aimed at a widower, and you can hear every one of them. For about 4 years, I gave one of 2 answers, and both of them were wrong. The first was, fine, bright and quick, to close it down. And what that does is tell a decent person that the subject is shut, and they never ask again, and after a while, nobody's asking anything, and you've done that yourself. The second answer was worse, and I did it in the bad stretch. I'd tell them, properly, at length, in a doorway or a hardware store, to somebody who had asked a small polite question and got a large true answer they had no way to hold. And I'd watch it land, and I'd watch them go looking for something to say, and I'd watch them not find it. That's how a man teaches an entire town to be careful with him. Here's what I do now, and it took me a long while to arrive at. I answer the size of the question. If a fellow at the hardware store says, "How are you getting on?" that is a small question, and it wants a small, true answer. Not good, small, and true. This week's been quiet, or the shop's going well, or February's long. Any of those is honest, and none of them hands him a weight. And if it's Susan on a Thursday, and she's actually asking, that's a large question, and it gets a large answer. And she's my daughter, and she's a nurse, and she can hold it. Now the other half of number 2, which is the half nobody mentions. You have to ask them back and mean it. That's the whole of it. Because the man who is being pitied is the man who has become the subject of every conversation he's in. And a good deal of the time, he's the one who put himself there. I did that for years without noticing. Every exchange was about my situation. Because my situation was the largest thing in my head, and I let it be the largest thing in the room. Now I ask about the fellow's knee, or his daughter in Portland, or what he's doing about that fence. And what happens every time, without fail, is that his face changes. Not out of relief that he's off the hook. It's that he's just been spoken to by a person rather than a condition, and he's glad, and he'll come and find me next Saturday. That's the whole mechanism. Pity ends the second the other fellow realizes he's in a conversation. Now I want to be fair to the people asking, because they are not a nuisance. Most of them have no idea what to say to a widower. There's no training for it, and nobody gets much practice. And a decent person standing in front of an old man whose wife has died is frightened of getting it wrong. The head tilt and the careful voice aren't condescension. They're a man doing his best with no instructions. I know because I did it myself for 50 years. When Bob's father died in about 1979, I said something to him at the funeral that I'd give a good deal to take back. And I said it because I could not stand the silence. So, they're not the enemy. They're working from a conclusion, and the conclusion is the only thing anybody gave them, which means it falls to you to give them a better one. And that isn't fair, and it's the situation regardless. Before the next one, tell me in the comments the thing people say to you that you wish they'd stop saying. Just the phrase. I'd like to see them. And I suspect a good many of us are getting the same 3 or 4. I read every single comment, and I answer as many as these old hands allow. There's a second half to answering the size of the question, and it took me years. Never answer with the whole account. That's what I did in the bad stretch, and it comes from a good place. You're being asked how you are, and you decide to be honest. And honest means everything. But the whole account is not more honest than a piece of it. It's just longer. A man who says February's been long has told the truth. A man who tells the same fellow about the 3rd year and the wardrobe and the noise the house makes at 2 in the morning has also told the truth, and has additionally handed a man in a hardware store something he cannot put down. Both are true. Only one of them can be received. The test is, can this person do anything with what I'm about to say? If they can, my daughter, Marie, my son on a Sunday, give them the whole of it, because that's what those people are for. And withholding from them is its own mistake, and I made that one for 18 months. If they can't, give them a piece. A true piece, not a false, cheerful one. And I'll give you mine, since I've just asked for yours. There's one that gets said to me perhaps twice a month, and I've never worked out a good response. You're doing so well. Every time. And I know exactly what's meant, and it's kindly meant. And I nod and thank them. But sit with it a minute. Doing so well against what? Against the assumption that a man in my position ought to be in a considerably worse state than I am. That's the measure being applied, and the compliment only makes sense if the low expectation is already sitting there underneath it. I'm not offended by it. I'd not correct anybody. It's simply the clearest example I know of pity dressed up as praise, and once you've heard it that way, you'll hear it every time. Number 3. I can walk into a room where everybody else is a pair, and stay, and not leave early. That's the hardest one on this list, and I'll not pretend otherwise. Church suppers. A neighbor's 50th. A wedding, my nephew's, up in Old Town, about 4 years ago. Every table in that hall was 2, 4, 6. And a table of 6 with one man at it is not a table of 6. It's a table of 5 and a widower. and everybody in that room does the arithmetic without meaning to, including him. I left that wedding early. I want to be honest. I stayed about an hour and a quarter, and I said something about the drive, and I went out to the truck and sat in it for a minute before I started it. And I was 75 years old. And here's what I understood driving home, which took the whole of Route 2 to work out. Nobody had done a thing to me. Not one person in that hall was unkind. My nephew was delighted I'd come. 2 women I'd known for 30 years sat down beside me at different points and were good company. The pity was entirely mine. I brought it in with me, I carried it round that hall for an hour and a quarter, and then I drove it home. That's the part that took me years. A good deal of what an old man calls other people's pity is a thing he's doing to himself, in a room full of people who are perfectly glad he came. So what do I do now? I go. And I go early. And that's the whole technique, and it sounds like nothing. Early is when people arrive one at a time, and there's nowhere to sit yet, and nobody's in a group. If you walk into that hall at the height of it, every conversation is already formed, and you're a man looking for a way in. Get there 20 minutes before, and you're one of 4 people standing about, and you'll have spoken to all 3 of them before anybody else arrives, and by the time it's full, you're in it. Same room, same man, same absent wife. 20 minutes. The other thing I do is I've stopped leaving early. And I've made that a rule rather than a decision. Because leaving early is not a decision, it's a thing that happens to a man at about the 90-minute mark when the room gets loud. And if it's up for negotiation on the night he'll lose. I stay until people start going. Then I go with them, which is a completely different exit, and every person in that hall reads it differently. There's a third thing I do at those, and I'd not have thought of it myself. It came from Marie, who is married to a friend of mine named Bob, and who is 9 years into the same business I'm in. She said, take a job, not sit at a table and be a guest. Turn up and find something that wants doing. She's done it at church suppers for years. She's on the tee, or she's putting chairs out, or she's the one who knows where the extra plates are. I laughed and said it sounded like a woman's solution, and she looked at me the way she looks at me and said, what do you do at a wedding, Walter, when the conversation's formed and you're standing there? I hadn't an answer, so I've done it since. At my great-niece's last summer, I spent 20 minutes putting a marquee side back up that had come loose in the wind, with 2 young fellows who had no idea what they were doing, and I've not enjoyed 20 minutes at a wedding more in 30 years. Nobody pities a man who is holding a pole. And it isn't a trick. That's the thing. I was actually useful, that side would have come down. It's simply that a room organized into pairs has no place for a single man standing about, and a job creates one instantly, and there is nearly always a job. Now, I want to say the honest part about number 3, because I've made it sound like a technique and there's something underneath it that no technique reaches. Some rooms are just hard. Anniversary parties. That's mine. I can do a wedding now, and I can do a funeral without any difficulty at all. And a 50th anniversary is a room I still have to work at. Because I know what 50 years is and what it takes. And the 2 people at the front of that room have got something I had and haven't got. That's not pity from anybody. That's a fact standing in the room with me. And I go anyway. I'd not skip a 50th. But I'll not tell you I've solved it. Because I haven't. And there are 3 or 4 kinds of room a year that cost me something, and I've come to think that's the fare. You pay it, and you go. The alternative is a man who only attends the easy ones. And that man's world gets smaller by about 1 room a year until there aren't any left. And I'd add one more thing to number 3 that's a good deal simpler than the rest of it. Go to the ones where you're wanted for something other than sympathy. There's a difference between an invitation that says come we'd like you there, and an invitation that says, come, we're worried about you. Both are kindly meant, and both will be extended to a widower, and you can tell which is which inside of about a sentence. The first kind you say yes to every single time. That's a room where you're a guest. The second kind, and I'd be careful how I say this, because those people are not doing anything wrong, and they're generally the ones who care most. The second kind is a room where you're an item on somebody's list, and there is nothing wrong with that either, and it is not going to do for you what the first kind does. I say yes to both. I'd not turn down a soul at my age. But I've learned to know which is which walking in, because a man who thinks he's a guest and turns out to be a project has an evening that costs him something. And a man who knows going in is fine either way. There's a last piece of number 3 that I'd give to anybody who's been at this a while. The rooms get easier, and they get easier in an order. Funerals went first for me. That surprised me. You'd think those would be the worst. They're not. And I worked out why. At a funeral, everybody in the building is dealing with the same thing. And nobody is a pair in any way that matters. And an old widower is not the odd item in that room. He's the one who knows the ground. Then the ordinary ones. Church suppers, a neighbor's birthday, the diner on a Saturday. Then weddings, which took about 6 years, and which I can now do properly and stay to the end of. And the anniversaries are still hard and may always be. And I've made my peace with that. So if you're 2 years in and every room is impossible, they don't all come back at once, and they don't come back in the order you'd expect. Start with the funerals and the ordinary ones. Leave the weddings for year 6. Nobody told me that, and I'd have found it useful, which is most of why I say anything at all. Number 4 now, and this is the one I promised you. Stay with me. Number 4. Remember I said number 4 turns the whole business on its head. Here it is. Nobody pities a man whose table they're sitting at. That's the inversion, and it took me about 5 years to find. Everything I'd done up to that point was defensive. I was managing how I was received, the answers, the arriving early, the not leaving. All of it was a man trying to be perceived correctly. And then one afternoon, Elaine from down the road was in this kitchen for coffee, which she'd been doing for a while by then, and I said something about how she was always coming up here. And she said, well, you never come down. That was it. That was the entire conversation, and I thought about it for a fortnight, because she was right, and it went further than she meant it. I had spent 3 years being visited. Every social thing in my life was somebody else's initiative. David rang me. Susan rang me. Elaine came up the road. The church rang about the supper. Marie and I had lunch, and I checked this afterward, and I did not enjoy finding it out. She had arranged 11 of the first 12. I was not a participant in my own life. I was a stop on other people's rounds. And that is what produces pity. Not being alone, being the object of everybody's arrangements, and never the author of one. So I had them here. Started small. I had Elaine and her husband up for a supper. I cooked it, badly. A chicken that was drier than I'd like, and it was the first time in 3 years that somebody had come to this house, because I asked them. Then the Sullivans down the road, the young couple with the little one. Then Marie, which I should have done 2 years earlier. Then, and this took some working up to, the Prescotts, who Helen and I had seen twice a year for 20 years, and who I'd not spoken to properly since the funeral. I want to tell you what actually changes, because it is not what I expected. It is not that people think better of you. That's the shallow version, and it isn't it. It's what happens in the room. A man in his own kitchen has a job. He's got the coffee to see to, and a chair to pull out, and he knows where everything is. And he's the one saying, sit down, sit there, that one wobbles. He is, for the whole of that hour, in charge of something. And a man in charge of something cannot be pitied. It's not a matter of opinion. The shape of the thing won't allow it. You cannot sit in a man's kitchen, drinking coffee he made, in a chair he told you to take, and hold the view that he's to be felt sorry for. The furniture of the situation forbids it. That's why number 4 is on this list, and that's why it's the one that turns it over. Everything else is about how you carry yourself. This one changes the actual arrangement. And I'd say to anybody who's been visited for a while and can feel it, it doesn't have to be a supper. That's what stopped me for 2 years. The notion that having somebody in meant cooking properly and clearing the house. It's a pot of coffee and 2 chairs on a Tuesday. That's the whole of it. Nobody over the age of 70 is expecting entertainment. They want a chair and an hour and somebody who's glad they came. Ring one person this week and say come up on Thursday. That's it. And then put the coffee on and be the man who's got the coffee on. There's one more thing under number 4, and I'd not want to leave it out, because it's the thing that could go wrong with everything I've said tonight. Refusing pity is not the same as refusing help. Those are 2 entirely different things, and I have watched proud men get them confused, and it has cost them years. And I very nearly did it myself. Pity is a conclusion somebody has come to about your life. Help is a hand. And here's how you tell them apart, because they can look identical from 4 feet away. Help leaves you larger. Pity leaves you smaller. That's the whole test, and it's remarkably reliable once you start applying it. When my son put a grab bar in my shower, which I refused for the better part of a year on grounds of pure vanity, I came out of that larger. I've got a house I can go on living in. When somebody uses that voice on me, the bright, slow one people use on small children, I come out of that smaller. Every time. Same well-meaning person, quite often. The bar and the voice have arrived from the same fellow in the same afternoon. So take the bar, take the ride, take the ladder work, take the son who comes up 1 weekend a month. Every bit of that is a hand, and a man who refuses hands at 82 is not proud. He's just going to fall off something. Refuse the conclusion. Keep the help. And I'd give you the practical form of number 4, because I've been talking about a principle, and a principle is no use on a Tuesday. Start with coffee and 1 person. Not a supper, not a group. 1 person, 1 pot of coffee, and about an hour, and you'll find you can do it, and that a good deal of what stopped you was a picture in your head of something much larger. The house does not have to be right. That was my second obstacle, and it was worse than the first. I spent a fortnight before Elaine's first supper thinking about the state of this house, and she has been coming up here for 4 years since, and I promise you, she has never once looked at the skirting. And the food does not have to be good. I gave those people a dry chicken, and every one of them came back. Nobody is coming for the chicken. That's the thing I could not get into my head at 78. They're coming because a man asked them, which is a thing that had not happened in 3 years. And the chicken is not the point, and never was. Now, the second piece, and it's the one that made the difference for me. Make it a standing arrangement rather than an occasion. An occasion is a great deal of work, and it happens twice a year, and then you're back where you started. A standing arrangement runs by itself. Elaine comes up most weeks, and neither of us arranges it anymore. Marie and I have lunch about once a month, and it's simply what happens. That's 4 years of a thing that took 1 telephone call to start, and it has required approximately no effort since. The effort is entirely at the beginning. That's the good news, and I'd not have believed it. And there's a third piece which I'd put to the men particularly. You have got something to offer, and you very likely stop noticing it. I'm a carpenter, 45 years. And what I worked out, later than I should have, is that there are a great many people on this road who need something fixed and haven't got anybody to fix it. That is not a small thing to be able to offer. It's a considerable thing. The Sullivans down the road, the young couple with the little one, their porch was going. And I did it with the husband over a couple of weekends about 4 years ago, and their baby slept in a cradle I made out of butternut. That family does not pity me. It is structurally impossible. I am the fellow up the road who rebuilt their porch and made the cradle their daughter slept in. And whatever your trade was, and everybody watching this had one. Whether it was a trade or a desk or a house full of children raised properly, you have got something. A woman who ran a home for 40 years knows things that nobody in a young household knows. A man who kept accounts knows what to do about a form that has frightened somebody. Offer it. Once. To one person. Because the whole of number 4 is that pity flows in one direction, and the second you send something the other way, it stops. Now I'll say the last thing about number 4, and then we'll go to the last one. I did not do any of this out of strength. I did it because Elaine said 7 words to me in my own kitchen, and I did not care for how they sat. That's the honest account. A woman down the road said, "You never come down." And a proud man went away and thought about it for a fortnight, and then rang somebody. So if you're sitting there thinking you haven't got it in you, I had neither. What I had was a remark I couldn't stop turning over. Take mine if you want it. You never come down. Have a fortnight with that and see what you do. There's one more thing I'd say under number 4, and it's for anybody who tried it once and it went badly. Mine went badly. The first supper was the dry chicken, and I have not mentioned the rest of it. I talked too much. That's what actually happened. 3 years of not having anybody in this house, and I sat those 2 people down, and I talked at them for the better part of 2 hours. And I could see about halfway through that I was doing it, and I could not stop. I went to bed that night thinking I'd made a fool of myself, and that I'd not do it again. They came back. That's the whole point of telling you. 4 years on, Elaine is up here most weeks, and neither of us remembers that evening except me. A man out of practice at having people in will be out of practice, and it will show. And it doesn't matter in the slightest. Nobody's grading you. They came because you asked, and they'll come again because you ask again. And the 4th one is nothing at all. So if you tried it once in the 2nd year and it was awkward and you filed the whole idea away, get it back out. It was awkward because it was the first one. That's all that was. And I'd add the one about the house, since I mentioned the skirting. Do not clean for it. I mean that seriously. If you spend 3 days getting a house ready, you have turned an hour of coffee into a week of work, and you will not do it twice. And the whole arrangement dies of its own weight. Wipe the table. Put the kettle on. That's the standard. And it's the standard because it's the only one you'll keep for 4 years. And 4 years is what makes it a life rather than an occasion. Number 5. I can say my wife's name in an ordinary sentence without wrecking the room. That's the last one, and it's the one I'd keep if I had to give up the other 4. Here's what I mean. And it's very specific. For about the first 4 years, if Helen came up, it was an occasion. My voice would do something. The other person would go still. And then there'd be about 10 seconds where they were working out what the correct response was. And I'd be watching them work it out. And the conversation would not properly recover. So I stopped mentioning her. Not deliberately. It's simply that a man learns, and what I'd learned was that saying her name cost the room something. 4 years I did that. And I want you to understand what 4 years of that actually is. It's a man who was married 54 years, going about his life and never once mentioning the largest fact of it. Now I say her name the way any married man says his wife's name. She'd have liked that. Helen used to say the same thing. She'd never have let me get away with that. Just, in the middle of a sentence, about the weather or a fence or somebody's grandson. Ordinary, in passing. Not stopping afterward to see how it landed. And here's what happens, and it's the reason it's number 5. They relax. Because what they'd been doing all that time, with the careful voice and the head tilt, was trying to work out 2 things. Is he all right? And am I allowed to mention her? Say her name easily and you've answered both in about 4 seconds. She's dead. I'm all right. And you may bring her up. And then they do. That's the part I did not see coming. Ray Prescott told me a thing about Helen last spring. Something she'd said to him in about 1994 at a table in his house that I had never heard in my life. 22 years of my wife being alive and 8 years of her being dead, and that story had been sitting in that man's head the whole time. He'd never told me, because for 8 years there had been no version of a conversation in which he could. I got a piece of my wife back that I did not have. From a fellow I'd been having twice yearly dinners with since 1996. And I've thought since about how much of that there must be. Every person who knew her has got some of her that I haven't got. And the only way any of it comes back to me is if I make it safe for them to say it. That's what number 5 actually buys. It's not about dignity, and it isn't about pity, in the end. It's that a man who can say his wife's name in an ordinary sentence gets given pieces of her for the rest of his life. And a man who can't, doesn't. And I want to say how I actually got there, because it did not happen by deciding to. It was my son. David rings on a Sunday and has done every week for 9 years without missing one. And for the first 3 of those years, neither of us mentioned his mother. Not once, in any real way. She'd come up as a fact if a fact required her, and that was the whole of it. 3 years of a man and his son talking every week, and neither one saying the name of the woman they both missed most in the world. He was sparing me. I was sparing him. And between the 2 of us, we had built a perfect silence around her, and both of us thought we were being kind. It broke on an ordinary Sunday in about the 4th year, and I could not tell you why that one. I said something, I don't remember what. Something small about a thing she used to do with the garden, and I said it in an ordinary voice and didn't stop afterward. And there was a pause on that telephone of about 2 seconds, and then he told me something about her. Something from when he was 19. A thing she'd said to him that I had never heard in my life. 19 years old. That'd be about 1987. 30-odd years that had been sitting in my son's head, and there had been no way for him to hand it to me. I wrote it down in the notebook that night. I keep a hardbound one in the desk drawer in the front room with 60-odd of her phrases in it, and it's one of the 60. And it's the only one that didn't come out of my own memory. We talk about her every few weeks now. Not heavily. She comes up the way a person comes up, and I have got a good deal of her back that I did not have, from a man who was in the house for the whole of it and saw a completely different woman than I did, because a son sees a different woman than a husband does. That's what the silence was costing, and neither of us had any idea. So if there's somebody in your family who knew them, and there nearly always is, you may find they are holding a great deal and waiting for permission. You're the one who issues it. Nobody else can. And you issue it by saying the name in an ordinary voice in the middle of a sentence about something else, and then carrying on. That's all it takes. I did it by accident on a Sunday, and I got my wife's 1987 back. So, the 5. Sit down at a table on your own and eat, with nothing in your hands. Answer the size of the question, and ask one back. Get to the room early and leave when everybody leaves. Be the one who invites, and be the man with the coffee on. And say her name in the middle of a sentence about a fence. Not one of those requires you to be strong. I want that said plainly, because there's a version of this talk that's about toughness, and I've no interest in it. Every one of them is about the same thing, which is being a person in the room rather than a situation in the room. Pity is what people give a situation. They can't help it, and they don't mean anything by it, and most of them are perfectly good people who'd come out in the night if you rang them. They're just reading what's in front of them, and a fair amount of what's in front of them I put there myself for about 4 years without ever once knowing I was doing it. I'm 82. There's a chest of drawers on the bench out there with a third drawer to fit in the morning, and Elaine's coming up Thursday, and I've got the good coffee in. Nobody pities me. Not because I'm formidable. I'm an old carpenter with a bad knee. Because there's nothing in the room to pity. There's just a fellow who lives here, and he's got the coffee on, and he asked you what you did about that fence. And I'll say the last thing to the man who's about 2 years into this, and finding the whole list impossible. You're not going to do 5 things. Nobody does 5 things. I did them over about 6 years, and I did them badly and out of order. And 3 of them only happened because somebody else said something that I couldn't stop turning over. Pick the one that made you uncomfortable while I was talking about it. There'll have been one. That's the one. And do the smallest possible version of it this week. Not the whole thing. Go to the diner and leave the paper in the truck. Ring one person and say, "Come up Thursday." Say her name once, in the middle of a sentence, to somebody at a counter. That's a week's work, and it's about 4 minutes of actual effort. And the reason I'm putting it that small is that I know exactly what happens to a man who decides to change 5 things at once in February. He does none of them by the Thursday, and he concludes that he can't be helped. And he's wrong. One thing. This week. The small version. And do it because you'd rather be in the conversation than be the subject of it. That's the actual prize, and it's a good deal better than not being pitied. I've got a fellow at that diner who tells me about the road commission most Saturdays. He has no idea I'm a widower, and I've never told him, and it has never once come up. That's about the best hour of my week, and it took me 2 years and a forgotten newspaper. If what stayed with you was number 4, if you've worked out that you've been visited for a while and haven't invited anybody in years, I made another talk about exactly that. About the 5 people I speak to every week and the 5 completely different jobs they do. It's right there on the screen. The kettle's still warm. I'll see you there.